Recently, I did something I've not done in quite a long time. I hit play and listened to the start of one of my episodes. I've really not done that in a long time. But what I noticed was, my show kicks off pretty quickly. The musical intro is over in seconds, and I think that's not really the norm in the world of podcasts. And I think that's a decent reflection of the book, or not the book, sorry, the short story, or maybe novella, that we'll be looking at in this episode of the show. It's The Wandering Earth by Liu Cixin, and it, from what I remember, basically starts us off in media res, I believe is the pretentious term for after the story has already begun. The Earth is on its journey away from our solar system to somewhere else to escape an exploding sun. So, no big deal, just a small sort of realistic little social drama by Mr. Liu Cixin. On that Earth, one interesting topic that he does dig into a bit, which the movie adaptation did also dig into in a quite different way, is internationalism. This is one of my hang-ups over Liu's work, actually. If you've been listening to this show religiously, I think you'll have noticed that. It's interesting to see where he does and doesn't think about cultures or people or nations or geographic regions coming together or not, and the ways that they interact. And that's sort of an appropriate theme to dwell on in this episode, because the show guest I've got on is Jairo Morales, who's Peruvian, and he reads books mostly in Spanish. And he's a little bit like me. He's one of these online book second order. So he talks about books in podcast form on YouTube and so on. He's also a writer as well. He writes his own stories, but he'll be appearing on this show in basically the role of the, what would you call it? The fiction influencer, the internet literary critic, whatever. Me and him are going to be talking about The Wandering Earth, a book or short story, or novella, I should say, that we both really enjoyed. But one really interesting angle that we look at it at is like literary transmission, because he's reading the thing in Chinese to Spanish translation. I'm reading it in a Chinese to English translation, and at various points we're musing about what the Chinese original version might be like, but also what Chinese literature gets transmitted to our own regions of the world, number one, and languages, because of course Spanish, that's an interesting one. You have Spain, where the language came from, and then the other side of an ocean you have all these, a continent, obviously, Central and South America, all these Spanish-speaking nations. And, there's a whole other thing we didn't get into that could be interesting, transnational languages, because of course Chinese is pretty transnational thanks to the diaspora, but it's many different forms of Chinese which aren't always mutually intelligible. Spanish, I guess, is a lot more mutually intelligible, but I don't know why I'm talking about that here in the intro, because we don't talk about that in the episode, but it's just another of the multifarious angles you could take conversations like this, and I promise you, in my chat with Jairo, we go to places like that. But I've been talking for 3.5 minutes now, so I really need to get on to the next item, the terrific news. So where we talk about just things that are going on in the world of Chinese fiction, or at least translated Chinese fiction. So I got 4 news items for you today. Let's just go right on to the first one. It's a book review, and guess what? It's to do with Chinese sci-fi, my biggest hang-up of them all. So this is a review by, I think, a listener of the show, Virginia L. Kahn, who studies... What is her focus? She's very interested in Chinese sci-fi, but her academic focus is, oh great, it's on her bio on this page, depictions of the new socialist human in socialist science fiction, and how those depictions guided policy decisions in Mao-era China, Soviet Russia, and East Germany. And I think she's somewhat sympathetic to those old school red visions, although I'm sure as a good academic she'll be critical too. But I think that lefty critical stance informs her review of the book in question, AI 2041, co-authored by Mr. Kai-Fu Lee and Chen Qiufan. So a businessman working in the business of AI in Beijing, that's Kai-Fu, and a Chinese sci-fi author who's interested in basically all things futurism, sometimes from an optimistic point of view, but in his fiction it's often been, at least in stuff I read in English translation, chaotic and a little bit catastrophic, not so in the sense that anticipations of catastrophe, dislocation, ennui, chaos. That's how I would talk about Chen Qiufan. But in this book, I'll try and summarize this book review. Basically, Virginia, or Professor, Doctor, whatever, Virginia Alcon is critical of this uncritical stance that I think Chen Qiufan's stories and Kai-Fu Lee's essays, the uncritical stance they have towards AI and what it could do for the human race. I have not read the book, but from what I gather from this, review, it's generally uncritical or positive towards what AI could do for humanity. And I guess one could say pretty easily, look, fiction and sci-fi shouldn't just be cheering on the arrival of new technologies. I'm sympathetic to that. But I also think I think my take on this problem, perceived problem in the book, would be like, Kai-Fu Lee is the problem. Not to say he's a bad guy, or that he has problematic views, but like, if he's in the business of AI, like, it's just sort of baked in that the book isn't going to, or is likely not going to, kill the industry in its cradle. And if we're concerned that AI has worrying tendencies, so like gathering data on us in the name of capitalism rather than in the name of like human welfare, well, that's the world we live in. So no one asked for my hot take here, but my take on the problem that Virginia's highlighting in the review is, I don't really find it surprising that this is the stance the book takes to where the AI industry might be taking the world, because it's an industry run by businesses. This is what businesses do. Perhaps it would have been more interesting to see a sort of dueling approach where Kai-Fu Lee, the businessman, and Chen Qiufan, the speculative fiction writer, are like the optimist and the pessimist for sci-fi. But like, to me, that would be an upsetting binary, because I wouldn't want sci-fi author or just creative people to be the sort of anti-technological progress people. And so like, the ideal in my mind would be the Mr. AI CEO entrepreneur having an ambivalent approach to the AI future he's ushering in, and then the author having a similarly ambivalent approach. But I think basically we don't live in that perfect world where business critiques itself properly. It's basically the job of our politicians to rein these people in. And right now we live in an age where the Silicon Valleys of the world, be it the actual Silicon Valley or Zhongguancun, Beijing's Silicon Valley, they don't rein themselves in. They're in the business of destroying whatever reins might be on them. I mean, maybe I'm talking crap here. Maybe Zhongguancun is properly regulated, but I think basically I would have loved to see the book I guess Virginia wanted to see, but yeah, not in this life, unfortunately. Next news item. This is more cheerful, or at least I have nothing negative to say about this one, funnily enough, because a little bit like Kai-Fu Lee and the AI business, this is something I was involved in, so I'm not gonna throw mud at it. It was the Spotlight Taiwan, Reading Taiwan, Contemporary Literature and a Film in a Global Context symposium run by the Lead Center for New Chinese Writing. So again, religious listeners of the show will know that I attended something a bit like this, before COVID, in Leeds. It was a genre fiction symposium. Well, I've been to something similar, but this one was about lit from Taiwan, and I am going to do a Patreon episode talking all about my experience there. Suffice to say, it was really, really fun. Met lots of incredible people, and a lot of it was held online as Zoom events, which were saved, like recorded and saved. So I think the ladies who run the Lead Center, Frances and Sarah, are planning to put those online, I guess, up onto YouTube. So I'm going to keep my eyes open for those. And if they do go up onto YouTube, then I'll make sure to include them in a future news item for you guys, the listeners. There is a program of the event that I will link to in the show notes. That will just show you what went down. There won't be a great deal of content for you to consume, but there will be a lot of interesting people from either Taiwanese literature itself or studies and discussion of it. So yeah, you can check it out. Okay, second to last news item. This is an interview with a Hong Kong author. It's been translated to English and is available in the original Chinese as well. It's an interview with Dorothy Tse, an author I've not covered on the show yet, but whose books, at least a couple of her books, are available in English translation. So a person you could check out, even if you don't read Chinese. This interview is pretty short, but not mega short either. Lots of interesting questions, a dozen of them, in fact. And it's available, it was created and posted by the Sinophone HKKH, the Sinophone Hong Kong Literature Translation Anthologies. And they actually have several of these interviews with quite a lot of interesting people. There's Chris Song is in there. He is an academic, I believe. I've read a book he co-authored. He's got all sorts of, or at least that book I read, had all sorts of interesting angles on culture of various forms coming out of the mainland. So there will be a link to that in the show notes as well if you want to check it out. Okay, last news item. It's more sci-fi. I'm massively excited about this one. This is a big deal, guys. It's an announcement by Amazon Crossing, who are Amazon Publishing's imprint of translated fiction, basically, and they've got a really great Chinese selection. They are going to be publishing, they have announced this via a tweet, they're going to be publishing a trilogy, the Hospital Trilogy, by the mainland author Han Song. So the trilogy the 3 books of the trilogy go by the names Hospital, Exorcism, and Dead Souls. Dead Souls, that's a particularly cool one, because I'm pretty sure there is a Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Let me check that right now. Dead Souls. Yeah, that is a Nikolai Gogol book, or story. Yeah, a novel. And that interests me because Liu Xun's book, Diary of a Madman, shares a name with a Nikolai Gogol book, I'm pretty sure. I'm Googling this. Diary of a Madman. There's also a Ozzy Osbourne album with the same name. Yeah, it's a Nikolai Gogol short story as well as a Liu Xun short story. So I don't know. I'm missing the point here, which is that my favorite Chinese sci-fi author is getting 3 novels, which are a trilogy, translated into English and made available through Amazon Publishing, which means it should be very widely available. Now, there's going to be a long wait for these. These are coming out in January 2023. So I guess Michael Berry, who is going to be the translator, probably hasn't translated them all yet, or perhaps he's almost done. But of course, publishing translated fiction, that is a long and fiddly process, as publishing any book is, but translation, you've got that extra level or 2 of complication. We can say as well about the translator, he's an interesting dude, because he's an academic. So it's interesting that he's the fella that's been picked for Han Song, because I wasn't aware he'd sort of stepped into the ring of Chinese sci-fi in academia or translation, so to speak, but he's done it now, because he's also going to be or possibly already has by this point, doing a talk, an interview with Cixin Liu on The Wandering Earth, funnily enough, which this very episode that you're in right now is on. So I'm going to need to message. I'm going to have to slide into Michael Berry's DMs. He's a professor of Chinese Lit and Film and the director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. He's entered my radar. I'm going to have to enter his. On that note, 15 whole minutes, at least pre-editing, 15 whole minutes into the show. That is the end of the Trochovic news. So I will shut up now, and you guys can hear my chat with Jairo Morales about The Wandering Earth. We are on the show with Jairo Morales. Hi, Jairo. How are you doing, and what have you been up to?
Hello. I am fine, actually. It's right now for people hearing us. I am in the other side of the planet. It's 7 a.m. in the morning. And yeah, I am doing good. I am in my second cup of coffee right now.
I'm impressed you can start so early, to be honest. I couldn't do that.
I am a morning person. I really love waking up early.
There was one episode I did way back with I think he's a Chinese American translator, and I don't know how the time differences worked. I don't know, but we were both drinking a gin and tonic. Just by chance.
Wow.
We didn't plan it, but we were both drinking a gin and tonic as we talked. So I made sure this time to make my own coffee, although it's 1 p.m. here, so I don't really need it as much as you do. But I thought it would be a fun thing to do.
Drinking gin and tonic in the morning is also good.
That's true. Yeah, I might have done that at least once in my life. So the listeners might be wondering who you are. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, relating to literature especially?
Sure. Right now I'm living in Lima, in Peru. Honestly, my profession is work in advertisement. I have been working in advertising for about 10 years right now. But I really love books. I have always loved science fiction and fantasy books. I have always been reading them. And right now I am working, well, I have a podcast, a literature podcast where I talk about not only books, but we also talk about writing itself. I also write. I love writing, and I have this podcast called El Rincón del Escritor. Maybe the translation in English should be Writer's Corner.
Right.
And we talk about a lot of writing. Everything about writing, about writer's block and how to avoid it and all that stuff. And I also talk about books in videos, and maybe I can say that I am a content creator. That's it. I make videos for Instagram Reels and TikTok, and the pandemic made me do all that stuff because I had a lot of time in my hands. And I started, recording videos, talking about books, recording podcasts, and writing stories. And that's who I am in the literature world.
Yeah, I can relate to what you said about the pandemic. So I started this show when I was on a master's.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a reasonable amount of time to work on it because my study, it was a full-time study, but I still had a bit of time to do some part-time work and the show without going crazy. Then when my dissertation started, I had to leave it alone. And when there was a very short window between finishing that master's and working sort of freelance from home, where I was able to keep the show going reasonably well. Not so long after that, the pandemic hit. And although I was working, when I wasn't working, I was doing nothing. So it was a good time for my show as well. And
yeah,
I want to say as well, the fact we're doing Liu Cixin and that you yourself are a fan of literature in general and you're not China literature focused academic or translator, I don't think it's too much of a coincidence, because I found on this show it can be very hard to get people who want to be guests to talk with lots of enthusiasm about a book if they don't have some specific connection to academia or Chinese lit in some way. But with Liu Cixin, I've had no problem with that at all. My last guest in my last episode about a Liu Cixin book, he was an American guy who just loves, like, I guess, geek culture. And I think Three Bodies, the only, aside from maybe some kung fu movies, I think the Three Body Problem was his only contact with popular Chinese culture. But he was able to talk about it with me for like almost 3 hours. So there's something about Liu Cixin's journeys in translation that I think makes him special. So it's exciting to be talking about him with another reader who is not like me and most of my guests sort of pinned to China in some way or other. That's great. I guess we can move on to the basics of the story, because I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. So better not to beat around the bush for too long. I guess the absolute basic of the story here is that the sun is about to blow up at some point. Humanity needs a way out, and what they decide to do, they use a brute force plan. They turn the Earth into one big great ship powered by rockets, leave the sun's orbit, and they're heading for another, I think it's another star where they can reset their orbit and live and continue humanity. But the catch is, because of the vast distances of space, this is going to be a multi-generation, maybe even multi-century, I don't remember, plan.
Yeah, it's a travel about with 2,500 years to Alpha Centauri.
There you go. No big deal. Yeah. Just 2,500 years. Yeah. And the story doesn't try to cover that whole time. It just follows the lifespan of one guy. And he witnesses some, I guess, basically a series of horrific events. Just awful things keep happening. Everything comes to a boiling point and almost goes dreadfully wrong in ways that are kind of interesting to compare with the three body problem, I think. Maybe we could talk about that. There's some other things that happen along the way. I'll pause my summary there. Do you think there's any interesting points in the plot that we should explain to the listeners that are really important?
Yes, actually, there are 2 points. The first one is the one that I always say when I recommend Cixin Liu's work to people, and it's that you need to be ready for the effect that you will have reading Liu's works, because you will feel tiny. You will feel like your life is really, really short.
Mhm.
And that will make you realize a lot of things, and that will depend on the person reading the book, but yeah, that's the first thing I always say when I
Yep.
recommend Cixin Liu's work. And the second point is that it's different. I have been reading science fiction. At least in Latin America, the first science fiction that you encounter are Julio Verne's work. Then, if you keep reading them, you're going to find, for example, Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, and all those guys. But then, when you read Cixin Liu's, you will realize that it's anything. There is no book like that. There are no stories like that, and it's only with Cixin Liu's. Only it's with Chinese science fiction in general. But those are the 2 points that I always say when I recommend Liu's works.
Out of all the translated Chinese sci-fi I've read, I would agree. Like he's totally unique. His exactly what you said about kind of terrifying feelings about being small. Other
Yes.
Chinese sci-fi I've read doesn't have that. There are similar things. There are writers who are not afraid to make things kind of dread-inducing, or there are other writers who I don't know. I feel like one thing Liu Cixin does is there's a lot of things that you can read very easily as a metaphor for like China versus the US or China versus
Yes.
possible colonizing powers. I think there is some of that in other Chinese sci-fi, but basically he's unique. There's something I've prepared in advance that relates a lot to what you said about the feelings of like horror, basically, or awe and horror together. So I don't think I talked about this on the show before. I have a Kindle, so I read a lot of books on my Kindle, this one included, and it has a feature where you can highlight text. And when you do that, it actually stores all that highlighted text in a text file. So what I do is I copy that text, I put it in a Google Doc, and I update it every so often. So thankfully, I did that for this one. And I've got a couple quotes from the English translation, because I guess we should underline here. I read the English translation, you read the Spanish translation.
And I read the Spanish, yes.
And we did not read the Chinese because my Chinese is not good enough to read stories. And I guess you don't really have any because we're readers in translation.
Yeah, I read them in translation.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the English translation. So I'll read 2 parts here. Let me just find the right ones really quickly. So I'm not. Yeah, okay, here's one. It was always a nightmarish scene when the beam of an Earth engine cut through dark clouds. The clouds scattered a brilliant bluish-white light of the beam, erupting it into countless frenzied, surging halos of rainbow light that covered the entire sky like white-hot magma. One time, my senile grandfather, tormented by the unrelenting heat, couldn't take it anymore. When a heavy downpour started, he was so elated that he ran outside, bare to the waist. And content warning here: if anyone's eating, pause eating. We couldn't stop him in time, and the top of his skin was scalded off by the raindrops, which were heated to a boil by the Earth engine's plasma beams. So that was one, and here's the next one. I think this one it cuts a bit deeper, and it reminds me of how I felt reading some of the Three Body Problem, being aware about those things you mentioned, life's short, and so on. Here, the mouth of the plasma jet was directly above us. The beam emanating from it was so enormous that when we tilted our heads up, all we could see was a gargantuan wall of blue plasma reaching into infinity above us. Looking far up that blue, I then recalled a riddle posed to us in philosophy class. You are walking along a plane when you suddenly come across a wall, I told my teacher. It stretches endlessly upward, endlessly downward, endlessly to your left, and endlessly to your right. What is this wall? Our haggard teacher had asked our class that riddle. I now asked Ms. Xing, curious at her answer. Even the memory of that question made me shudder as we stood atop the engine. Ms. Xing looked at me, thinking of the answer. After a perplexed moment, she shook her head as she contemplated my query. Leaning close, I whispered the riddle's terrible answer into her ear. Death. For a few seconds, she stared at me in silence and then suddenly embraced me, which is the right thing to do for a kid who's having these messed up thoughts. Yeah, that's a really good description of how some of Three Body made me think like, shit, I'm gonna die one day and there'll be nothing after. Ugh, not a nice
Yeah,
thought.
yeah. Actually, this is the first time that I hear that I listen the translation in English, and it really is the same in Spanish. It captures that same aura. It feels the same. And now, right now, I am depressed again. But yeah,
I'm sorry
it's a
about
good
that.
translation. No, it's okay.
I guess we can move to the next little point is how we came across the story and our first
Yeah.
impressions reading it. So I've talked about this, how the first Chinese lit I started reading on a lot in this show. But basically, long story short, when I was living in China, I mostly wasn't reading Chinese lit at all because I was homesick. So I was reading Western stuff. But I read in the time I lived there, I did read three things that were translated from Chinese to English. One of them was the three body problem. And
Mm-hmm.
after I came home, I started devouring translated Chinese stuff because I was homesick for China. So that's how I ended up reading this one. But what about yourself? How did you come to The Wandering Earth?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, I want to ask you how big was Liu's work back there in China
Oh,
at that
yeah, no,
moment?
that's a good question. I, as far as I'm aware, he's still huge over there. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
one great thing about reading Three Body Problem, if you're living in China or if you have read it and then go to China, is that's something you can talk about with just about anybody Chinese who's, I don't know, not a really old person. So I was there. I'm
Mm-hmm.
28 now. I was in my 20s living there. And if I mention, oh yeah, I read Santi. Santi is the three body problem, literally just a three body. I said, oh yeah, I read Three Body Problem. I read Santi by Liu Cixin. Have you heard about that? What do you think about it? And pretty much everyone had either read it or they had an opinion about it. So
Wow.
he's huge over there. The question I'm not so sure of because I've only read these people since leaving China is how big other sci-fi writers are in China. I don't really know. My feeling is that Liu Cixin is in like the popular consciousness and
Yes.
culture, and then if you're a fan of sci-fi or Chinese sci-fi, then you might know the other names. So kind of similar to their reception in the English speaking world. But to be
Mm-hmm.
honest, I don't know. I could be totally wrong. I should really ask some of my Chinese friends about that.
Yeah, that would be great actually, because I believe that maybe Hao Jingfang it's also big over there. Maybe I am not sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. She's widely published. Her and maybe like
Yeah.
some of the older Chinese science fiction authors, maybe Chen Qiufan, like I know they have whole novels out, and Hao Jingfang
Yeah.
has like literary fiction books as well, not just sci-fi. And I had Ken Liu, the big translator of Chinese to English sci-fi, on the show to talk about one of her books that came out in translation, and he was very he made a big point of emphasizing to me that her work that she does is mostly nothing to do with literature. She does work on like improving problems related to economic equality, work helping kids,
Okay.
economic planning, stuff like that. So if she's famous for that, I don't know, but maybe not. But I know certainly if you go on YouTube on the Chinese internet as well, you can find lots of talks she gives.
Yeah.
So she might be a case where she's also a public intellectual as well as an author.
That's great. That's great, actually. Now, going back to your question about how I discovered that this story. Well, I have to be honest with the Wandering Earth. The first thing I saw was the movie,
Mm,
because here in Netflix, it made a big deal about it, and in Twitter, everybody was talking about that. I used to follow a lot of Spanish people because my family lives there, and I know a bunch of people there, and they are all working in literature. They have bookstores and stuff like that, and they are always talking about science fiction. And they told me about this movie that was coming to Netflix, and it was based on a story of this Chinese guy called Cixin Liu. And I was thinking, this Chinese guy, this the man who wrote it, Three by Problem, is going to be amazing. And that's the first thing I saw, the movie. And then after I saw that, I said, I have to read this. I cannot read. I cannot not read this. So I remember, getting up of the sofa and going to the library. We were talking before the pandemic, and I went to the library. One of my favorite libraries in Lima is literally like 5 blocks away from my place. And I went there, I catch the book. It was really new. Nobody was talking about this. And I read it and my mind was blown. Obviously, as every movie, I realized that the movie, it's just a movie. The story, it's another thing. But yeah, that's how I discovered this story in particular, because the way I discovered Cixin Liu is really different. Because the first book I read was The Three Body Problem, and I discovered it because of Barack Obama.
Yes, I think a lot of people did. Yeah.
That they made a really good marketing in Latin America with that. And so that's it. That's the way I discovered him.
I'm sure I've said this on the show before, but the reason I ran into Three Body was that it was getting like articles written about it in English, and I'm sure Barack Obama's involvement there, put it in one of his holiday reading lists when he went off to Hawaii, and I'm sure that helped it get into those articles, which helped it get into my frame of reference. I guess it's worth talking about the reception of the film, because I read the book I read The Wandering Earth story collection, which is how the books this short story is available in English, maybe half a year before the film got its release. And from what I remember, I saw a lot of buzz leading up to the release of the film. But then, of course, I was going to see that because I was desperately consuming any news related to China because I was back home in Scotland and missing my old life there. So it seemed like it was getting reported on, like the BBC did one or two articles about it and stuff. But then when it got its release in the UK, I don't think it got a cinema release. I know it got some kind of small cinema release in the US, but even that, it wasn't in many cinemas, I believe. And when it did arrive on Netflix in the UK, I don't think it got pushed much into people's feeds or their main screens. So I think the only people I know who've seen the film would be like Chinese friends or people specifically interested in Liu Cixin. I don't think I know many like normal people who've seen it who are not Chinese. But I don't know if you would agree. I thought the film was kind of So I think if it had been a better film, it might have blown up a bit more.
Well, regarding the reception, well, you have to know in Latin America, how can I say this in a gently way? People only tend to see science fiction and fantasy as bad literature. If you are talking with, I don't know, with a senior, with some older person, and you talk about you're reading science fiction, they tend to look you in a bad way, because in Latin America, because of the Latin American boom with Cortázar, Borges, Vargas Llosa, and all those guys back in the 1970s, people tend to say that literature is big, it's better than science fiction and fantasy. And I grew up in that society. Right now we are in that society, but I realized that their books are great, but I enjoy science fiction more. I enjoy fantasy more because we are living in a science fiction world. We are currently living in a rock in the middle of the space, going around the sun. Below us, we have magma, and above us, there is just a zone that if it goes, it will just go away. But I honestly, talking about that, people doesn't love science fiction a lot in this place, but there are a lot of, the young people right now are embracing these kind of stories again. We are talking right now in October, and for example, we have the big series on Netflix right now is Squid Game. And that thing is, it's fiction, but the way the story is told, it's making people more aware of this kind of stories. Right now, we're watching more these kind of science fiction stories, fantasy stories, or because they love this kind of series. But the reception here, we never had that on movies. We never have The Wandering Earth. We received that on Netflix. And I know a lot of people in Spain that talked about the movie. I discovered the movie because of that.
Right.
But then again, talking about how I enjoyed that movie, well, I honestly liked it because maybe I never read the story. Maybe that was it. Because I saw the movie first, and I say, I really honestly, I never think there is a bad movie. I never think that, because it's always, the director's vision and the writer's vision too. And I enjoyed the movie, but obviously when I read the story, it was a different story, because then I realized, okay, this movie, I don't know, I thought that the movie could have gone in other ways, different ways than they showed us. No, but yeah, that's what I think. I can say that I enjoyed the movie a little bit. That's my reaction actually.
Yeah, I'm gonna make a mental bookmark to
Mhm.
remember to talk about differences between the film and the book, because
Great.
I think like sorry, there's a fly flying around my face. Got it. I guess the source of the main crisis that's like the main part of the plot in the book is different in the book and the film.
Yes.
And I think that could basically be related to like political sensitivity, censorship. I think it's probably fair to say, but
You think that, because one
yeah,
of the things, for example, I saw the movie yesterday, so it's really fresh in my head,
right.
and the first thing I noticed that was that the change of the problem,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that maybe it was because they wanted to make it a sensitive movie, but I don't know if Chinese people are that way. I grew up with a lot of Chinese people here, and they, literally like the memes, like their parents, they just don't care, and they only want them to study hard, and that's it. So yeah, I saw the movie, and I realized that maybe they changed that because of, I don't know, sensitive things. You say now it's more like,
To focus on science.
yeah.
Yeah, because if we think about the crisis in the original story, I think the idea is a large group of people stop believing in the mission. They think it was wrong to abandon the Earth as the sun, because the sun was never really going to blow up,
Yeah.
and they start basically a huge revolt, and they win. Like they overpowered the authorities, and our main character is sort of in a difficult situation because his wife, who's a Japanese lady, again, I don't think you'd see that in a Chinese film, for reasons I'll get into.
Huh.
Um,
Yeah, you're right.
yeah, he's sort of caught up, is conflicted. His side basically loses, so the rebels win. They're going to overthrow the Earth's government, and just in the nick of time, they see that the sun, I think, has detonated, and the rebels realize they were wrong. And I guess I can first mention why I think, and this is reading politics into the story. I know that
Mhm.
Ken Leo, the translator of Free Body, basically says about Chinese sci-fi, don't do this, don't try and make it all about politics. But I think it's fair to say that my got reasons for interpreting this way. So if you think of in the Three Body Problem, how it opens with the Cultural Revolution, this
Mhm.
huge, how can I say it, upheaval in Mao Zedong's China in like the late 60s through to the 70s.
Yeah.
That was a very unstable time of a kind of rebellion. It's pretty complicated, but basically, to sum it up maybe a little bit too quickly, Mao Zedong felt as a leader his power was slipping a little bit, and that the revolution was becoming, not like the energy of the revolution was being lost, and he called for like the young people to rise up. The phrase in English is bombard the headquarters, and like kind of bring down local or mid-level officials. And what that created for quite a long time in Chinese society was these factional battles that you see at
Mhm.
the start of Free Body, where people are fighting, there's rebellion. And an interesting thing about modern China is this is like quite a lot of awful things happened during Mao's time in charge after the revolution. So there was like famine,
Yeah.
purges against intellectuals, and the Cultural Revolution is just one of those. But the only one that the government has ever really like discussed or said kind of declared was like a mistake was the Cultural Revolution. So in a lot of Chinese literature from like the 80s onwards after Mao's death, it was big writers were able to write about the Cultural Revolution and kind of criticize it and not get in trouble.
Mhm.
And although it's still a sensitive topic, writers who kind of are respected enough were able to write critically about it. But in like more mainstream pop culture, TV, films, I don't think you really see any criticism of it. So there's this thing, if you read enough translated Chinese fiction, you can notice this pretty quickly. If you compare it with TV and films,
Yeah.
the literature is less heavily censored than the films, because I think it's because it has a smaller audience. It's not being beamed into people's homes on a screen. So anyway, my feeling is that Liu Cixin was able to write about this very cultural revolution-esque situation in his book, because that's sort of a norm to write about stuff like that in literature. But I think the film was intended for like audiences of millions of people.
Yeah.
And it would have been just very tricky to have this extended sequence of the people rising up and attacking the government. I think the only time you'll see that in a Chinese film is if it's the civil, if it's communist rebels overthrowing the Republican government, because
Yes.
that's the good rebellion. That one is okay. But anything in the present or the future is it's probably not going to pass the censors.
I have never reading The Wandering Earth. I read that scene, but I didn't make the connection that you say. But talking about this reminds me the beginning of the three-body problem. We have a whole chapter talking about a rebellion and how that scene makes the rest of the first book at least. And well, here's a question. It's more like, why the government, the Chinese government, doesn't think that it's, they're not looking very careful to the literature, to the Chinese literature right now, because as you say, there you can talk about it, but why is that?
Well, I would say that's like one topic that is okay to discuss. It's those like political topics that you can discuss are quite limited. That is one.
Okay.
Another one that has been okay in recent years is corruption at like a more local level. So it's a really interesting film made by a director who's very good at going right to the edge of what you're allowed to discuss. The film is called, the English name is I Am Not Madame Bovary. The Mandarin name is Wobusha Panjinlian, I think. And it follows this woman who lives in the countryside who's cheated by her husband. She what do they think they're faking a divorce to get extra licenses to buy houses or something. And he uses it as an excuse to say, oh, I really divorced you and now I'm going to cheat on you. And she's not happy. So she takes it to the first level local official above her. So like a countryside level guy. And that guy doesn't take her side, I think, because she knows her husband. So she goes to the next level up. That guy is corrupt. She goes to so from county, it's prefecture. Basically, she goes up every level of government trying to get help. And the leaders of those levels they're uninterested, they're lazy, or they're corrupt, or they're too useless to help her. So she ends up doing it's a real thing in China, where every I think 4 years, every so many years, there's this big conference in Beijing where loads of officials gather for a big conference. And in theory, it's a big democratic discussion. I think in practice, they show up and they say, yes, we agree. But in any case, it's a big meeting.
Okay.
And a lot of ordinary Chinese people will go there because they've been failed at every level of the government. So they go to the top, they go to the leaders to get some help. And
oh, wow.
That's a real thing. And this film showed it, and it showed you how corrupt the lower level officials were. But it never said anything bad about anyone right at the top, because that would be, if you do that, the film's not going to get released and it will damage your career. And it's interesting because this film came out around the same time that the top level of government, I guess the president Xi Jinping, was doing a big anti-corruption push, targeting every level of government, of course, except himself. So a few people at the top got taken down. And then at the lowest levels and the mid levels of government, again, like thousands of officials were punished or fired. So at that time, it was encouraged to talk about corruption at those levels. But of course, there are certain limits that you're in trouble if you go to them. So it's an interesting thing. So like, to give you an example, in, I guess, the 50s, there was a huge famine that basically resulted from bad policy choices and what am I trying to say? False reporting of figures. There was a push by the new revolutionary government to like modernize, collectivize farms, trying to do all these revolutionary things. but long story short, was really badly managed. I guess a lack of common sense and corruption caused huge numbers of starvation and deaths in lots of parts of the country. That's something the government has basically never apologized for, owned up to. All discussion of it will not get published or made into a movie. That's a banned topic. And unless, I guess it would probably only ever become an unbanned topic if the government felt enough time has passed that it was safe to open it up, or if the government changed and became less authoritarian. But I think basically if it risks a huge outrage against them, it stays in that list of banned topics. So although it seems contradictory, Three Body Problem was able to show scenes of the Cultural Revolution and the terrible effects it had on that the character's father, but it wouldn't show maybe 10 years earlier where perhaps people they knew were starving.
Yeah, I realized that.
So that wasn't a very short explanation, but
yeah,
it's enormously complicated once you get into it.
Yeah, I can imagine that, because but that's the sort of topics that you tend to talk about when you read these kind of books, because it makes you talk about that. So that's something that I am always surprised when I'm reading this kind of fiction, because it makes us talk about this. It makes us, in Latin America, we are always talking about how different is the Chinese culture with the rest of the world. Well, not Latin America, at least me and my girlfriend and some friends that I have that we read this kind of science fiction. It's something that we are always wondering how amazing is the fact that having China as a authoritarian country, but at the same time being one of the most advanced in technologies and SNS, social technologies. It's really, really, really amazing. I think that the closest that I got to that a social network future is when I was in South Korea. There, just like China, they have some 2-3 apps and everything is connected. Everything is connected. Everything, works the same way, and that's it. The government knows where are you, and what are you doing, and what you're watching right now. So that's something that I always, I found really, really interesting, because I live here in Latin America. We have, it's a democratic country, but we don't have that same technologies, that same, advanced technologies that they have there. But that's something that I always found interesting regarding China, regarding everything like that.
No, yeah, it's a very interesting comparison here living in the UK, which things are easy and seamless here and a headache in China, and vice versa, what's easy to do in China versus what's a headache here. Oh man, there's so many different examples I could make. One might be like the use of QR codes. So yesterday, me and my girlfriend went into Manchester, the big city near us, and first thing we did, went into a cafe to get some coffee, and they had a system where they got a little very cheap paper thing standing up that says, for COVID reasons, or I don't know if it was because of COVID reasons, but it looked quite new. Please scan this QR code to get onto the menu, make your order that way. And this was here in the UK, that's, I guess, brand new or really strange. But years ago in China, that was the norm in lots of restaurants. Some restaurants would even supply you with a tablet, and you could make your order on an app on their tablet. So, and there's a whole payment system. You can buy your food just scanning QRs, but they don't have contactless payment with their bank cards there. Whereas here in the UK, you can, with your phone or your card, you can beep, make a payment. I guess trains is another comparison. The Chinese train fast rail system is, it's amazing. It's much better than the UK's trains. The UK's trains system is, it's divided up by dozens of different little private companies. It's stupid. It's illogical. But sometimes buying a ticket in China can be a bit of a nightmare because you've got to go collect it from a real person. I think it's different if you're a Chinese citizen. There are some machines you can collect your tickets from. But as a foreigner, you can't use those machines because they will only accept a Chinese ID card. I came across a station that had a machine which had English. They bothered to make an English language setting for it, but there's no way you can scan your your passport. You can only scan a Chinese ID to collect your ticket. So yeah, there are like when people talk about China as an incredibly advanced country, like in some areas, yes, it's catching up or is ahead of the other most advanced countries. Places like Shanghai are future cities. But you also got to remember there are parts of the system, which I didn't do a very good job of describing, but some things are mind-numbingly backwards. And a lot of the country is like still a peasant society in the countryside. It's I don't really know how that would compare with like South Korea or Japan, but I think it's much more of a crazy contrast, almost like time travel, going from Shanghai on a train out to the countryside outside Shanghai.
Yeah, I think that's the same, at least in the fact that when you leave the capital and you go to cities in the middle of the country, you will always find this kind of difference. You will always think that in that city the future never came. That sounds poetic, but that's true. Actually, here in Lima, we can always say that here in the capital, it's really different. And in fact, here in the city, we have a lot of people coming from the provinces, cities in the middle of the country, and it's really, we have a really different variety of cultures here, because in Peru we have three different regions. We have the coast next to the sea. Then we have the mountains, it's called the Sierra, and then we have the jungle, the Amazonian rainforest, where I am from. And it's really different. And also the food is different, and the food is better, in my opinion. But it's that we can see that. And talking about the difference in the different people we have here, I can say that I can as well, we have a lot of a big Chinese community here. Big one, because in the 20th century, when we had all these kind of revolutions in the country and people were trying to make the country what it is today, there were a lot of, I don't know how do you say this in English, the caucho, rubber.
Right, the product from trees, right?
In the 20th century, we have this era of rubber, because where we have a lot of islands where people can take that and make some for manufacture things and stuff like that. And they began to bring Chinese people to work and in the countryside. And that's when they the Chinese community began to grow in this part of the country. And right now we have a lot. I believe that in all countries we have this Chinatown, and because of that, once I read in I don't know if it was an essay talking about how Chinese people tend to stay together always everywhere around the world, and that's something that you can always see in movies when you read books, and that's one of the things that remains the same wherever you go, And so here in Lima, we have a lot of Chinese people with with stores, with restaurants, Chinese food restaurants, and even in I am from Iquitos, an island in the middle of the rainforest, in the Amazonian rainforest in Peru. And I grew up with a lot of Chinese friends. Their parents were having Chinese food restaurants, some stores, and they were really great people. That was my first approach with them. So talking about the advance and the way how traditions work, they were my first approach to this mix, to this, talking about the tradition, because we were, for example, in the 90s, we were playing with our Game Boys, and at the same time we were in their table, eating dim sums and talking about celebrating the Chinese New Year. Everything was kind of that. And yeah, it's kind of amazing to see how far things are going there, but at the same time, looking how close the country is, and sometimes the people too. But yeah, that's something that I saw. And talking talking about this, it reminded me of that.
Even in this little, well, it's not super small, but the little
Mhm.
town I'm in Cheshire, we have like 10 minutes one way down the road. There's a Chinese takeaway. 15 minutes walking in the opposite direction. There's another one. So like north and south. If I go east on my way to work, I
Mhm.
pass another one. And the interesting local adaptation that they have here is two of those three Chinese restaurants are also the local fish and chip shop. I don't know if you know about fish and chips in the UK, but like that's the most popular traditional form of takeaway. And the best place to get fish and chips in this town, at least in our end of town, is the Chinese takeaway. So yeah, they're like even I guess even here out in almost the middle of nowhere, the diaspora, Chinese diaspora are doing their thing.
Yeah.
What you said about the countryside, actually, several things you said about when describing Peru sound quite similar to China and Chinese society. Maybe because they're have gone through some similar historical stages or development. So yeah, like I was saying about China, if the cities are where the wealth and the development is, if you go out to the countryside, you're going back in time. You said something similar applies in Peru, but here in the
Yeah.
UK, it's really quite different. A lot of the less wealthy people are in certain like council estates in cities or in left behind towns. So like the town I'm in is actually there's a lot of wealthy people here at the south end of town. There is
Mhm.
one council estate, so like government housing near where I am. It's not so bad. It's not so badly off. So like the poorest places in the UK can often be in cities. And often if you go into the countryside, that's where you're getting into like big money, people working in, I don't know, finance or business or people who've inherited their wealth and so on. It's a strong contrast with China, I would say. One of the strongest opposites, certainly with China, because I think a lot of things in human societies are not opposites. Like I don't think Chinese and Western culture are opposite at all. But certainly the UK's spread of wealth between urban and rural is almost opposite China, I think. Now, another thing I was going to say, talking about some things in common perhaps between China and Latin America. And this is something I did not learn when I lived there. I learned this doing this podcast, talking to people who are more expert in
Mhm.
Chinese lit than me, is that there is some influence between Latin American literature, like the stuff you mentioned from the 70s or
Mhm.
maybe 80s,
Yeah.
that had on China. So I mentioned there were some changes after Mao Zedong died. That was a really important time when the country began to sort of open, and the China we know today, which is sort of half open, half closed, a little bit socialist, a little bit capitalist. That China sort of had its birth, and that was really the dawn of modern Chinese literature. At least the restart after a big pause where everything had to submit to the ideology. That changed. There was still censorship, but not everything had to be like flying the red flag.
Yeah.
Um, and one thing that happened was because the floodgates had opened, Chinese literati, people who were writing high-minded fiction, had access to literature from outside very easily again, and they didn't really have a bias towards stuff in English, so they're reading a lot of stuff from Japan, perhaps Korea, I don't know, but certainly there was influence from Japan, and then all the European languages, which of course that would mean like the US and the UK, but on an even footing perhaps with like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, but probably equally important, like all of Latin America. And a lot of, I guess, if listeners don't know, there was a big wave at that time in Latin America that spread across the world that I suppose, at least in English, we'd mostly know as magical realism. So writers
Yeah.
like Gabriel Garcia Marquez,
Mhm.
Borges, you mentioned, all sorts of other authors. And I believe a lot of Chinese writers at that time were reading stuff like that and were sort of writing their own versions of it. So there's a very famous Chinese writer, Mo Yan. Have you heard of him?
Yes. He won a novel.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. A lot of his stuff is very sort of magical realist. I don't know if he's talked about the influences, but if you're to read some stuff from his generation of writers, it's totally there. And one thing that's interesting about that is so a lot of Western influence on China, because modern China is hugely influenced by the West in so many ways. Like
Mhm.
communism is a European ideology. That's one really
Yes.
obvious example. Um, a lot of that is filtered through like the Anglosphere, US or British Either it's directly from those places or it's been filtered through them. But this is a case where it totally sidesteps that. It's some kind of I guess whether it's a European influence or not, that's maybe a philosophical question. But it's an influence from a European language which totally has no connection with English or those imperial countries. It's and it's maybe makes a lot more sense because the conditions in, I guess, the developing countries of Asia are probably a lot more similar to the countries of South America than like empire building countries like the UK and the US.
Yes, actually, it's something. Yeah, it's exactly like that, because in the 70s, this literature wave that Latin America had was because in Spain, they were translating, well, not translating them, but they were publishing in Europe. So that way it reached, it was something that they never seen before. That's why people talk about that even now, 50 years later, maybe something like that, Well, we are in the talks about maybe we are right now experimenting a new wave again in Latin American literature and also in the Chinese literature. Something that I want to say is that here in Peru, at least, we tend to talk about, well, it's more like a joke, but in the inside, it is not a joke. But we tend to say that, China is going to be the next big country in the way of we see USA right now. We tend to say about that China is going to make everything better and bigger in the next few years. And one of the things that we always talk about is that how they are preparing their students and their athletes for the next Olympics, for the next FIFA World Cup and stuff like that. And, you have famous football soccer players right now working in China because they retired in this part of the world, and right now China gave them a lot of money and told them, come here, practice with us, these are the things that are happening. And we tend to talk about how China is really, really, really big right now because it's something that, want it or not, it's going to happen because we see it right now. Even in the pandemic, what happened was that, at least I'm talking about, again, from my point of view and some point of views of my friends and families here in Peru, that right now, because of the pandemics, USA is now seen as a bad guy from the story because of everything they did. Obviously, it has to do a lot with their president, ex-president, but yeah, it's something that it's changing a lot. It's really, really changing a lot, and I don't know. The history told us that what is going to happen, and sometimes it's repeating again. But yeah, I don't know. It's a lot of things to talk about, but everything happens or begins with the World War and maybe the cultural government and all that stuff that it's really, really interesting to see.
I think, yeah, claims about where the world powers of the world are going are always interesting. I'm always careful not to make any really hard predictions, but I think with China, it's hard to deny we're going to see something in our lifetimes, and I think that is why Chinese sci-fi is very interesting. It's
Yes.
like most sci-fi, it's looking to the future, and people have said, and I think it's somewhat true, that a lot of Western sci-fi right now, when it looks to the future, it's looking to like apocalypse or post-apocalypse situations. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's pretty interesting to read, but a lot of the Chinese sci-fi is looking at arguably more concrete or realistic future situations, or they're not just defaulting to the world is destroyed, what do we do after, which is interesting. I'm just going to run downstairs and get a book
Sure.
that is from the 70s. You'll see why this is relevant. 1 minute.
Right.
I'll be back really soon.
Okay, don't worry.
Right. Got it. So yeah, I was going to say, sort of making the opposite point to what we were talking about, it might be that all the big predictions about China come to nothing. And I think certainly in like you can find, if you want to find predictions of like doom and gloom relating to China from writers in the US, it's so easy to find. The book I brought up from my downstairs bookshelf was written in, I think, the 70s, and it's called The Emerging Japanese Superstate. So it's by this guy who was, I think, in like US like government sort of policy or think tank circles. And he wrote this book about how Japan, whose economy was really strong at the time, was basically going to sort of emerge as a world power and claim its place at the top, replace the USA. And he just turned out to be totally wrong. Japan, I don't think, ever had an ambition like that. And even if it did, its economy sort of flatlined in the 90s. And that was the end of it. And like, China is certainly not like, there's lots of weaknesses in its economy that we don't hear so much about. It has lots of problems. The authoritarian regime, you know, if it were to come down or suffer like some kind of collapse, that would be the story of the century, I think, never mind China coming out on top. So it's equally interesting to speculate what if something goes horribly wrong, and it's less exciting to speculate what if the Chinese development reaches a certain point and can't really get any further. I think it's maybe also worth remembering, like, there were points in the Cold War when people were sure that the USSR had the superior system, and that was it. But who knows?
I hope we have the chance to see it. You know, I hope that we have the chance to see it. I hope this, what I said before, doesn't get you in trouble. I mean, I hope it is.
Oh, no. I'm fine. I did have a show. I had this show on a Chinese podcast site, but it was doing fine until I did a season on Taiwanese literature.
Wow.
And then...
Okay, let's not say that word again then.
No, we're fine. We're fine. I don't, because that show's taken down now. And I never censored myself. I would only ever take things out to protect a Chinese guest.
I am not.
But you're not a Chinese guest. You're not.
But I plan to go to China, so I will just say good things. Yeah.
I think you'll be okay.
That book, I will look for that book right now. I am looking for that in Amazon right now.
Yeah, The Emerging Japanese Superstate. I think it's out of print. This one I got is from a secondhand bookshop.
Yeah, I'm seeing that right now. It's just in secondhand right now.
It's got a really, I have to say, a really beautiful cover design.
It's nice.
I really like it. But I'm sure that if this guy was alive today, he would have some explaining to do about how wrong he was. Anyway, we should probably get back to The Wandering Earth.
Sorry about that.
So this is my fault. And I think the listeners probably enjoyed our talk, so I don't think we need to worry. I wanted to ask you on rereading this book, because we both reread it for this episode. Did you notice anything you didn't notice before? Yeah, was there anything you noticed on your reread that hadn't been so obvious to you first time around?
What I noticed now I read it three times actually. The first thing I noticed was that the fact how I am talking now in the way he writes. Okay, I am a writer too, so I can't avoid that because anyway, I am a writer too. But the first thing I noticed was that how Liu tend to create a landscape of the whole story. That's something that I really like a lot about his writing. Because yes, it's going to be dark. It's going to be, maybe depressing for some people. But the way he starts the story is really, really amazing. I don't know how it starts in English, but in Spanish, it's, saying the character that he never saw the sunset or the, stuff like that. And it makes you wonder. It makes you realize what's going on with this earth in this story. And the second thing I noticed in this reread was how he describes society and how he tends to imagine what are going to be the next steps for the humanity. It always reminded me about, in Isaac Asimov's work trilogy, Foundation. I don't know the word in English, but there's this la psicohistoria. I don't know how's that in English. Psychohistory, I believe.
Psychohistory, like a psychological history?
Yeah, it's psychohistory. It's literally psychohistory. That's the word he coined for that book, for those books.
Right.
And it tends to, it combines history and psychology and statistics about how society is going to behave in certain point in the future. So when we reading The Wandering Earth and reading how, what we talk about, the revolution, that the uprising that came, and maybe people trying to, there is a scene where people are in their flying carts going, watching to the sun with some homemade telescopes and realizing that this is a lie. The sun was never going to explode, and they told us lies. That's something that we see right now in the pandemic. We have people believing that there are no pandemic, and we have anti-vax people, and that is what makes me surprised in this reread, how as a author Cixin Liu tend to see what's going on. Obviously it's just, maybe it's a coincidence, but the fact that he as an author sat down and wrote what was going to happen in his story, and years passed by. Right now we are in the middle of the pandemic, year 2 of the pandemic, and watching all these things happen, it's something that makes you wonder, and it's something that I really enjoy wondering.
Yeah, I have a very good reply to that, because this is something I noticed. I think I noticed it somewhat first time around, but my thoughts weren't fully formed. And now, having I haven't read a lot more Liu Cixin since then, but I've read sort of discussion of his works and a little bit about his sort of perspective as a writer, because I think it's fairly clear from some of the topics he hits on in this and Three Body, he must have some like political views or views about how human societies should organize themselves. And I think that a thing that this and Three Body have in common is the focus is on humanity organizing itself as like preparation for a worst case scenario. And it seems like, and it's hard to disagree with him, but he feels the things that you need to prioritize in these awful scenarios, like moving the Earth through space or preparing for alien invasion, is that the scientists should be in charge. People who are like smart, rational, logical, and technocratic should be in charge. And when people like emotional, ordinary, irrational, less sensible people get a hold on things, awful stuff happens. I know there's a very controversial bit in Three Body where there's a female character, what is she called? Chung Xin, who is a little bit more guided more by sentiment than by cold, hard reason. And although I don't think she's presented as a bad person, but when she makes a sentimental choice not to like press the nuclear button, that's what seals Earth's fate, and Earth is doomed. And I think you see that in Wandering Earth too, where these people who, like we're told in the pandemic, believe the science. Yeah. And the people who don't believe the science, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial when I say they're irrational, foolish people, people who don't want to get vaccinated, foolish and irresponsible people. And I think those are the nightmare people for Liu Cixin. I'm sure he doesn't like those people. So the reason I'm bringing this up is there's a really interesting essay on a website called chuang.org, or it's a publication. They bring out books of critical essays, political stuff. They have like a, I guess, quite far left perspective on China. So it's like basically a communist perspective that is critical of things that go on in China. So that's communist criticism, not like the Communist Party authoritarianism. And they have this essay just under their name, hasn't got any individual's name attached to it, called The Wandering Earth, a reflection on the Chinese New Right. And it's an attempt to like break people who are involved in online discussions on the Chinese internet into like different factions. And they identify, what is it here? They put it into two categories: Prometheans and young cyber nationalists, or you can translate it more literally to in the Industrial Party and Little Pinks. Now, I think I can read this in Chinese. industrial party, I think it says Gong Ya Tang, little pinks, Xiao Hong Fun, literally like little pinks, little reds. And the idea is the little pinks, they are people who are the red thing, you shouldn't read it as being like socialist, better to read it as like nationalist. They don't want to hear anyone criticize China.
Okay.
They're guided by like their emotions and their passions. They're nationalists basically. So forget the red part. And the industrial party, the Prometheans, they are people who this person is arguing are more like Liu Cixin. They want scientists, intelligent, rational science, STEM people basically to be in charge.
Yeah.
Science, technology, engineering, maths. They think that's the way to develop China, help it overtake the US, and so on. And the person who wrote this essay is arguing that in the film Wandering Earth, but maybe also in Liu Cixin's writing, you basically see, you kind of see these two things in tension, the Chinese nationalism and the more rational focus on like reason, putting the big brains, the technocrats in charge. But I think the argument is he's much more on the technocratic side of things. And I know if Ken Liu Cixin's English translator, was listening right now, he'd be banging my head against the desk saying, stop saying bad things about my author, stop making it all about politics. And like I myself don't think it's quite right to reduce Liu Cixin as this like right-wing pro-technology, pro-science authoritarian guy, because I think he has a lot of qualities as a sci-fi writer that go way beyond that. And I think he does have a warm heart. You can see that in how he writes some of the characters.
Yes.
But I think it's interesting to think about this angle when looking at his stuff. I think as people who like to read, we wouldn't really like to think of any authors of having these sort of lines of thought being sort of like having such a cold view of things. But while I wouldn't really agree with that view on how society should be organized, I think it's really interesting to read a writer who seems to have some of those ideas in his head and how he plays that out in his fiction.
Yeah, but I believe it's also because, Liu himself is a, computer engineer. And actually, in one of the interviews I saw, he confessed, I don't know if the right word is confess, but he said that he knew since he was a teenager that he wanted to be a science fiction writer. And so that's the reason he chose a career where he was close to the developing technologies. So that's why he chose computer engineer as a career. And that's the moment I realized that I should have studied something else, because I love science fiction too. But if you are not aware of the changes that we are currently having as a society and as a human beings, you will never write good science fiction. It's because you need to be close to the changes. And the fact that Cixin Liu made this, it's, as a writer myself, it makes me realize that that's bold. That's actually really, really great to do that, and it takes courage. But yeah, it's something that I really like. I tend to, when I read his works, I honestly always forget the fact that the political postures that he might have. I am just enjoying first. Then when I reread the books, the stories, that's when I tend to realize the similarities between his reality, because it's really different from ours. And other thing that he said in an interview was when somebody asked him how he imagined all those things in his stories regarding the science fiction itself, and he said something that it's always stuck in my mind, and I always say that in my podcast, is that in China, they are living the science fiction. They are currently living a science fiction world. That should be a title for a book, actually. But yeah, for example, 2 weeks ago, on Twitter, we had this video was trend topic in where I believe it was in Shanghai, where there were a lot of exhibition of drones showing some things in the sky, and maybe they say, I don't know if that's true, that the competition from that company hijacked the coordinates of those drones, and the drones started to fall down to the ground, and people were just recording that, and it was amazing because everything you see was a sky not full of stars, but full of drones falling. And that's when I thought, that's why they write those kind of science fiction. That's why they tend to write that. And it's amazing. That's something that we don't have here.
Yeah. I saw that one pop up too. I Googled it quickly. It was, I should point out, it wasn't in Shanghai, it was in Zhengzhou.
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting. So Zhengzhou is the capital of Henan province, which is, I think,
Hunan.
historically one of the less wealthy provinces. Although it has, in modern China, it's a less developed, poorer province. I think Zhengzhou is, if you're visiting China, there's lots of amazing cities you want to go to. Zhengzhou's not one of them. If you're going to Henan, I think you'd better to go to a historical site than the big city. Yeah. But yeah, this is a really interesting way of looking at it serves the point I was trying to make about the contrast between levels of development in China, because there are some amazing videos you can watch of drones performing spectacles. There's an incredible shot of a thing that happened in Shanghai. Drones from some company formed up to form a QR code in the sky.
Yes.
And people were posting that image alongside quotes from William Gibson novels, the cyberpunk writer. Perfect. But then in the exact same country, you have these nightmare scenarios where drones fall from the sky because something went wrong in the technology or someone hacked it. A thing I've tried to explain to a lot of people here back home is China is like one of the most chaotic places I've ever been to. So many things are disorganized, illogical, chaotic, confusing, and other things are amazingly slick, organized, friendly, sometimes unfriendly. Both those things are there at the same time in the same places. Although in this case, I think the contrast between Shanghai and Zhengzhou in Henan is worth underlining there.
Actually, when you say this about how China is a chaotic in that category, it reminds me this book from, I don't know if I am saying his name correctly, Chen Qiufan.
Chen Qiufan, yeah.
Yeah, Waste Tide.
Yeah.
For example, that book for me is one of the rarest cyberpunk books that I read, and when you said chaotic, that book came to my mind because it's exactly that.
It's like a storm, that one.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Chen Qiufan is an interesting guy. Like his appearance is always so like smooth and slick, and he always seems so calm. But so many of his stories are like chaos. Chaos reigns in loads of his stories. Waste Tide is not the favorite thing of his that I've read. I think I like his short stories better. But for a look at like all the crazy levels of just things that can be going on in one city in China, it's a great fictional version of that. Totally.
Yeah. I believe there is a short story from him. I don't know the title in English, but I remember that I read it in Invisible Planets, and that's
what's it about.
I only recall a passage. It was about a guy who was in a retreat, going away from, I believe, the city and all that stuff. I don't remember the title.
I think it's the fish. The English title is The Fish of Lijiang.
Lijiang, yeah, El Pez de Lijiang. Yeah, I remember that. That's one of the best short stories that I read. I really love that. I enjoyed that story because it was, again, depressing. I kind of liked that kind of stories, actually, because it's really, it connects with for me at least, with the modern society, at least in how I have no time at all to make things, my personal things, because of the work. But yeah, I read it before the pandemic, and I read it again a few months ago, and it changes a lot. Yeah.
Yes. What I was going to say there about the Fish of Lijiang is, again, this is a great example of Chinese sci-fi having a connection with reality. Lijiang is a real place. I've been there. I went I was on holiday there, just not using it as the same kind of holiday that main character is using it for. I was touring through that province, Yunnan.
Hmm.
But yeah, like the reputation of it being a place for sort of burnouts, people looking
Yeah.
for like a one night stand culture, that's a real thing. And he just sort of took it
Okay.
5 minutes into the future and turned it into a piece of fiction that people all over the world have been able to enjoy. So yeah, and I think I like about any fiction, but it applies to a lot of Chinese sci-fi, is that it's connected with real places that you could feasibly visit. Like anyone who was able to get a tourist visa for China and could fly in, get the right train, could go visit Lijiang, and then sort of put on their what's the word, augmented reality fiction reader spectacles and imagine it as Chen Qiufan's Lijiang. I realize that we've kind of gone all over the place in our conversation. Um,
Yes. Sorry about that.
no, no, it's good. It's good. I just wonder, do you want to talk about anything specific about the Wandering Earth? Because my next couple of topics were also quite general. Is there
Mhm.
anything about like characters or plot you want to hit on that we didn't hit on yet?
I believe that we already talked about everything regarding that, you know?
Yeah, I want to ask. I remember
Mhm.
we mentioned his Japanese wife. Did you find that interesting that we have a Japanese character who's a fairly major part of the events?
Yeah, I found it interesting because the first thing I thought was he's Chinese. Is this allowed? But but a few pages before that scene, we tend to see how society was changing because of that. And you talked about a little bit before about how certain the future must be seen for scientists. They have to be in charge. And there is a scene where Liu's work talks about how the future and the fact that the Earth was, moving to Alpha Centauri, people forgot about love, forgot about religion, and that's something that really stuck in my head because that scene prepared you for when the Japanese wife came, because that's when Liu told you things have changed. People are no longer attached to a place, to a ideology, to a religion.
Mm,
And that's something that I really honestly want to happen in this real world, because I am not those kind of person that tend to criticize the other. I am always enjoying the moment, and I am always open to see what other people think about. And I believe that's one of the stuff that I really love about this story. How that's why the Japanese wife never, I understood why he put her there. But
mhm.
then when the revolution came and she became all this stuff like, I am this other kind of ideology that I don't know. It just surprised me. I never saw that coming.
Yes. Now, this reminded me a lot, even on my first reading, this reminded me a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Three Body Problem, because in Three Body, it's an interesting conflict because on one hand, all of humanity comes together to solve its problems. On the other
Yes.
hand, we don't see a lot of blurring of like national identities. In fact, you see kind of the opposite. All the Western characters we meet, with like one or
Yeah.
two exceptions, are assholes basically, and they kind of fill a type. And I think he's making a good point here about like Western Europeans and Americans.
Mm-hmm.
They like to preach and talk down to the Chinese characters, take a moral
Yeah.
high ground, be quite stubborn and rigid, and sometimes do nasty things.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's a stereotype, but it's not entirely unjustified. So the one like Western character who is a cool guy is the Russian guy. So that felt like almost too deliberate on Liu Cixin's part. And then we do have also, I think, three Japanese characters appear, some more briefly than others. One is really briefly. There's like some Western guy in a spaceship. He's fleeing Earth. He sees, I forget exactly what happens, but like he in passing meets
Mm-hmm.
or glances at some Japanese woman and they have some sort of romantic connection. That's it. So that's a very brief, it's barely
Yeah.
worth commenting on. there's another Japanese woman who we think is all right, but is revealed to be a traitor in league with a traitor to mankind. With I think it's an American
Yeah,
boyfriend.
it's the wife, I believe,
Yeah,
from one of the, I don't know what's the chosen ones. They were,
yeah, the
I don't
wall
know how.
facers.
Yes, yes.
So a
I read it in
traitorous.
Spanish. Sorry.
Yeah, right. No, it's okay. So we have a beautiful Japanese woman,
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
treacherous, beautiful Japanese woman, and then the other Japanese character is Sofon, the alien robot who decides to take on a Japanese appearance. I think with like clothing, and
Yes.
she does Japanese tea ceremonies,
Hmm.
and she's a really interesting character because at first we think she's sort of friendly, then she becomes extremely vicious and sadistic in a way that made me think of some of the things Japanese soldiers did in World War II, like
Yeah.
striking people and stuff, driving them into prison camps. And then later, she becomes much more of a benign or benevolent or neutral sort of character and
Mhm.
befriends our heroes, who are all, of course, Chinese. And then in this story, again, we have it's on my first reading, I was like, well, when she became a baddie, I was like, well, surprise, surprise, it's Liu Cixin with his grinding his axe against Japanese women and not men, only women. Interesting pattern. But then on my reread, I thought she is actually a more interesting character because she seems to be a genuinely like intelligent, nice person when we first meet her. And when she goes bad, she really thinks she's doing the right thing, and she's
Yeah.
been pushed to a desperate situation. And at the end, the main character has survived with his kids and his grandkids, and they are all this I thought was really interesting. So I have a quote here. I last visited the surface more than a dozen years ago, accompanied by my son, daughter-in-law, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. Oh yeah, and it also says a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. She was heavily pregnant by then. So if you think about this, he doesn't say it outright. His son is half Chinese, half Japanese.
Hmm.
This son has, I guess, married. Yeah, he's married a girl who's must be European in some kind,
Yeah.
and this European girl is pregnant. So their kid is going to be part Chinese, part Japanese, part
Yeah.
something
Yes.
European. So that is the future that we don't see in Three Body in a way. If you see what I mean, like a multicultural mixed race future. You only see a snatch of it, but I totally missed that on my first read, that he's hinting at something that he never hinted at really in Three Body.
And if you keep reading that part, just going to the end of that story, the character remembers the Japanese wife,
Hmm.
and that sort of stuck out for me because um, for me it ended with her as a bad person, but as you say, she's not really bad. She just thinks different and she takes a stand, and that's something, everybody can do that. But having the character remembering her at the end of the lines of the story is something that made me realize that okay, maybe he doesn't have a grudge with her, that he doesn't hate her. He never did that. Even the way they meet, it's actually for me one of the most beautiful scenes, because though that scene has one of the great descriptions of loneliness and how immense the space is, and how we as a humanity, we are just tiny, you know I really love that. And yeah, I believe that the character of that Japanese woman is really interesting, and I know it's going to have a lot of we are going to have a lot of different perspectives with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. It felt a lot more. I think it's more sincere and human than I noticed on my first reading. The last thing I wanted to mention about the story
Mm-hmm.
before we talk about some other stuff
Yeah.
is how the stuff I enjoyed most, I think, in on my reread especially, was the descriptions of basically all the trauma the surface of the Earth has to go through. It's a so what we were saying how a reminder of the story and his stories in general remind you how small, vulnerable, short-lived we are against the huge scale of the universe. But also, it's a reminder of how fragile the Earth's ecosystem is. Because right now
Yeah.
we have an Earth that has all sorts of different environments, burning deserts, frozen North Pole and South Pole, oceans, land, blah, 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 blah. It's very diverse with lots of animals. And in this story, like the earth gets scorched, it gets frozen, it gets flooded, it's burned by rain. It's totally barely or totally uninhabitable most of the time. It's
Mhm.
totally it's whatever environment it's in, either huge burning rockets or freezing cold space. It's totally at the mercy of those things. And the way it's described, and certainly in the English translation, is fantastic. It felt like the story almost just existed so that those descriptions could exist in a way. I thought it was brilliant.
Yes. The reason why I went to buy the book before after I saw the movie was because of that. I have always enjoyed the destruction of Earth in media culture. I have always enjoyed that those kind of movies. And when I saw the Wandering Earth, the movie, I really loved everything the Earth went through. And when I went to read the story, because of that, I realized that descriptions are really, really great. I mean, this wasn't my first Cixin Liu's. This wasn't my first time reading Cixin Liu. I knew what I was going to find, but the way he describes everything that happens, and the fact that this is a story, more like a novelette, it makes it, at least as a point of view of a writer, it makes me realize that how good he is describing things, big things, in such a small amount of space. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. I am always enjoying that kind of described this how he describes all those things.
Yeah, totally. And I think what you were saying about the visuals of the film,
Mhm.
one thing I did like about the film that the story doesn't have is one of the missions our heroes in the film have to go on involves visiting the ruins of Shanghai. And they
Yes.
you see like the tops of the towers of the financial district poking out the ice. That was fantastic. And also, although I
Mhm.
was saying the film is like a more probably more a product of censorship than the story, that was actually it was a first time in Chinese cinema that you saw a destroyed uh, post-apocalyptic Chinese city. It
Oh
sort of
wow,
proved that you could
really?
depict that. Yeah, only the only times you would have seen anything like that in Chinese cinema before would be like destroyed by war, like if the
Mhm.
Japanese Imperial Army destroyed a city, or maybe if it was
Okay.
destroyed in a civil war, or of course way back in Imperial China, if I don't know the Mongols or something destroyed a city, you could show it.
Mhm.
But like a totally destroyed modern Chinese city, that I'm pretty sure that's a first in Chinese cinema, and obviously that's not a massive
Mhm.
landmark. That's not like a film where the Chinese president is assassinated or something, but it's still something. It's
Yeah.
a bold move, I think, showing destroyed Shanghai.
I didn't realize that actually, because as here we, I don't know, at least I am really always enjoying destroyed countries, cities in movies. So that's when I saw that, I just assumed it was normal, but now that you say that, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really normal to see destroyed New York or something. It would have been
Yes, they're always
easy.
destroying New York.
Exactly. Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
an easy thing for the Chinese filmmakers to show us destroyed New York or destroyed
Mhm.
Paris, but in a way, there's enough confidence there to be like, yeah,
Yeah.
well, we will show you our own destroyed city. Although we didn't show us destroyed Beijing. Maybe that would be a step too far. I wonder, can we talk about the world of Chinese sci-fi to Spanish translation since you're on
Mhm.
the show? I don't know how much you know. I was just wondering if there is like one big name translator. So I think I'm not entirely sure actually if it was Ken Liu or someone else who translated this to English, but certainly for like most of the big name Chinese sci-fi that exists in English translation, Ken
Mhm.
Liu is the guy.
Yeah.
I think that's changing now. I think he's maybe focusing more on his own work, and we're seeing other translators making more of a like a career or a mark. But like he's still like the man for English stuff that's been translated from
Yeah, he
Chinese
opened the
sci-fi.
gates. He opened the
Yeah,
gates. Yeah, he
totally.
made he made this possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's an interesting story, like the other publishers and authors that are involved. I can never quite remember it off by heart, I think the very opening move was made by a guy working in the Chinese. It's like an import export publishing business, so that handles a lot of like buying and selling rights for mostly things like textbooks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this guy saw potential for Chinese sci-fi, and I know that Ken Liu started translating Chinese sci-fi because of a conversation with Chen Qiufan. Have you heard this
Yeah,
story before?
I heard that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yep. So anyway, I was just wondering if you know, is there like one Spanish name that you see in a lot of these translations to Spanish?
No, we don't have that. I mean, there are several translators we have from different languages, but we don't have the top tier. We don't have a Ken Liu. Recently, maybe since 2018, maybe we are recently trying to show the translators on the book covers
Mm,
because that's a work that maybe people doesn't even care, you know but because of when I said that can you open the gates was because the publishers in Hispanoamerica, they said that they saw that a massive wave with a book, like with a trilogy from the Three Body Problem. They realized, okay, we need to translate this to Spanish because it's selling a
mm,
lot. And one of the things that I really am grateful of the Spanish publishers is that they translate directly from the source language to the Spanish. They don't use the English translation.
yeah.
So that's why we have, since the beginning, since the Three Body Problem, we have this kind of translator. I don't remember his name or her name. Honestly, I don't remember, but they tend to be two or three translators when we are talking about Chinese books because of different, the Chinese language itself is really complicated. So that's why I believe they need more than two translators sometimes. But yeah, I honestly don't know how difficult it might be. I believe that it should be a little bit difficult. Even Spanish is a rich language. We have a lot of words. We don't have just monosyllables like the English.
Mm,
In Spanish, it's really, really difficult sometimes. And I often heard some friends telling me, English speaking friends telling me that Spanish is really difficult for them. And even when, for us, as a, Spanish, we talk Spanish, it's really more easier for us to learn the Asian languages, such as Japanese, Chinese, or even Korean, the Hangul, because I don't know, maybe it's a romantic language that we have. We would tend to speak better. But anyway, regarding the translators, we don't have a big name yet, but the publishers are recently trying to put the translator's name on the book cover right now. That's something that maybe indie publishers are doing already. And yeah, I believe that's great. But again, the translation that we had from the Chinese to Spanish, at least from Cixin Liu's works, are really amazing. Really, really, are really great. They're I really enjoyed that, and I read some stories in English to see if it was good. And yeah, it's great.
I'm certainly not an expert in Chinese or Mandarin, and I'm not a translator, but I've talked to quite a lot of people who translate this stuff to English now,
Yeah.
and the feeling I get is that if a translator from any language to English deserves their name on the cover, certainly one language, where their translator really deserves credit as a kind of a, I know this is technically controversial, but like a creative contributor is Chinese to English. And I'm sure the same would apply to Chinese to Spanish. And that's because the languages are on just as,
Mhm.
a big difference is
Yeah.
Spanish and English are alphabetical
Mhm.
and Chinese uses characters. That's one big difference. But another huge difference is they're just in totally different language trees. I don't think they've really got, the only way that they've got overlap is in modern instances where Chinese has borrowed words from English or other European languages and has maybe
Yeah.
just like transliterated them or there's some obvious connection, but basically
Mhm.
there's nothing like, say, from English to French or English to Spanish, where you know exactly there's a perfect match word where you like,
Yeah.
where sometimes a computer will do just the same job as the human translator. For Chinese, I guess it's just far less the case, that you have to make a lot more choices as the translator, and the quality of, if you're a good translator, you could actually do amazing things with the story by finding perfect words or perfect ways to rearrange the sentence. So to me, like, if a Chinese story published in English doesn't have the translator's name at least somewhere on the cover or somewhere inside, it seems a bit
Mhm.
sus to me. Like, why have you concealed this person's name? Because this person is indispensable. Like, a
Yeah.
machine could never do this person's job. I'm sure that applies for translations between Spanish and English or vice versa, but for languages that are on totally different branches of the tree, like, it's crazy to me that there's cases where translators' names don't go on the cover or even in the book.
Yeah, I didn't knew that. Actually, I didn't know that about how or when to put a translator's name on the
Mm.
cover. But I believe, yeah, it's a lot of work, you know. For example, for Haruki Murakami's books, we have always had these direct translations from the Japanese to the Spanish.
Mm.
And honestly, I read the English ones, the ones translated by J. Robin, you know, Murakami's first translator, and it doesn't. It feels the same, as you say. When a translator is great, if we are lucky, well, we have the same feeling that the author wanted to create for the story. So that's something that I really enjoy. I
Mm.
will look more for that, and I will let you know as soon as because now I am curious about how the translators for Spanish works, because I can assume that it's a lot of work, you know, translating not only Chinese but science fiction. So
Mm.
that's something that as a translator you need to realize what you're doing.
Yeah. On the show, and also
Mm-hmm.
for my publishing masters, I thought a lot about different kinds of people who get involved in translating this stuff. My master's dissertation was about basically the business of translating Chinese sci-fi to English, and I took a wider look at just all Chinese lit in general going into English, and I had a go at breaking the types of translator into categories.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really remember those categories now, but there's all sorts of interesting things you can look at.
Yeah.
So, like, a really basic thing is like the translator's like nationality, like, and also their first language. I know that there's lots of angry, heated discussions about, like, if someone is translating Chinese to English, should their first language be English? Is that essential?
Mm-hmm.
I probably would never have an opinion on that because I wouldn't want to make anyone mad. But it's a question, like, what is their first language? What's their nationality? Are,
Interesting.
like, if they're British, are they British Chinese, or are they just like, do they have no like ethnic connection to China?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's those sorts of angles, identity sort of angles, but then also, like, are they an author? Do they write their own books? So, like, actually two of my favorite translators, Ken Liu and Jeremy Tiang, so they're both ethnically Chinese. One's Chinese American, one's Singaporean, but the thing that I think really sets them apart, although obviously that gives them an important something, is that they both write their own fiction in
Okay.
English, actually. So they're extremely competent writers of English, which means when they're translating, they can make a beautiful sentence. They're not just trying to write
Mm-hmm.
something for accuracy. So there's that. Another thing that's really big in Chinese to English translation is academic writers. A lot of the because this it translating, being a literary translator pays really badly. So if you're in
Yeah.
academia, you can sort of do it as part of your career, or university publishing houses might publish some of your work. So, like, some very interesting Chinese lit you can get in English has been put out by a university press, who sometimes don't really do a very good job of marketing it because they're not a commercial publisher. And sometimes the translators will have tried really hard to be accurate. And because they're an academic, they might have put loads of footnotes explaining things, which some people who just want to read fiction hate. Personally, I quite like footnotes, but the influence of academia on publishing books which in Chinese were just fiction for entertainment maybe is a thing. I suppose another thing might just be like people who are not so connected. So like there's one or two things translated from Chinese I've read from people who are not authors. They're not in academia. They've only got one or two translations to their name.
Yeah.
Like they're an interesting sort of. Do you know the phrase "a dark horse"?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's like someone who enters in a race and no one knows anything about them. So they're not famous for being bad or good. They're an unknown element. So there are some
Okay.
translators to me who are like sort of like dark horses.
Okay.
There's not so much info on them. They're not famous for anything. They're not attached to university, but they might do something very interesting because they're not from the same. They could have a very different perspective.
But to translate, from Chinese, I believe that you at least need to have this understanding of the Chinese culture. I believe that's something
Totally.
that you really need.
Yeah, and also an understanding of what your target readers can understand.
Yeah.
So, like speaking of dark horses, there was a translation from Amazon Crossing, who published stuff from translation, and they have a really good selection of translated Chinese books. They have a lot of genre fiction, because this is one problem with translation from Chinese to English that Chinese sci-fi helped to solve, is that they'll maybe because you could only get funding for important literary books, or because so much of the funding is from academia and they don't want to touch genre fiction. There's a similar sort of snobbishness in the English language literature to maybe what you were describing in Latin America. So genre fiction translations are hard to come by, but Amazon Crossing, I guess, because they just want to sell books, and Amazon has enough money to send rockets into space, so they don't mind taking some risks. So they have some genre fiction published, and there's one sort of like ghost horror story novel published by them called The Child's Past Life, although the Chinese name was way better. It was Sheng Se He, which is a life death river, like the river of life and death.
Okay.
So I don't know why they called it Child's Past Life, because that's a worse title. But the translator was, I don't know if she was like Chinese American or a Chinese migrant to the US, but she was some Chinese lady whose name I'd never come across before. Bits of the translation were really nicely done. Others, the English was a little wonky, but I thought it was really charmingly done. But there were some bits where she just sort of didn't bother to adapt it to something a reader would understand. I can't really think of any good examples, but there were bits where it was like, well, I'm really lucky that I lived in China for a few years, because if I didn't, this would be gibberish to me. And some of that's fine, because everyone's got Google, everyone can look something up. But there was some stuff where it was like, okay, this woman clearly has an understanding of Chinese culture, because I guess it seems like she's from there or grew up there or something. But you also have to know what your reader can get.
Yes.
Because like there's with Spanish and English, it's not so bad. But like with China, there's thousands of years of history. There's a whole pop culture, high culture, which is very rich and full of cultural references, which even me, 90%, I'm not going to get at all. A translator might know what to adapt or to explain or to swap for something else.
Yes, I also love footnotes, actually. That's something that I am not seeing lately in the books I am reading. And regarding the translation, we for Spanish, it's also difficult because sometimes we had bad translations. For example, Neuromancer from Gibson. It was a book that I didn't read until this year because I knew that the translation was bad. Everybody told me that do not read Neuromancer's translations right now, because it's a translation from 30 years ago, and it's not good. And right now we are currently having Spanish editorials republishing again classics, like for example Fahrenheit from Bradbury, Ursula K. Le Guin, but with a new translation. We are currently having that. And actually I bought recently a Neuromancer, the new edition from a translator that I know in Spain. And we are currently having great translations. I believe that publishers are recently focusing on hiring new and great translators. And that applies to the Chinese science fiction because it's really necessary, because of the words, because of the, all that stuff that comes to when we read the describings of the scenes and all that stuff. And I personally I try to read in Spanish because I know it's going to be a Chinese science fiction. I know it's going to be a long trip, and so that's at least for my to understand the story. But sometimes I read in English and I realize that it's really, really great. I read some of the I read Invisible Planets in English, and it's great. It's really, I really enjoyed the reading. But yeah.
I see that we've almost been talking for 2 hours, so I'm gonna keep us moving.
Wow, 2 hours. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
crazy. I've done these for 3 hours, or I think I once had one that was 3.5, and I managed to edit it down to 3 hours. But oh my god, I tried to avoid uh, stuff that long. One really last question, really quick last question about the scene where you are. You mentioned that there's a lot of Chinese diaspora families and people
Yeah.
living in Peru. Do you think that's affected, or has that affected the way writers like Liu Cixin have been received in Peru? Like, have you got Peruvian Chinese friends you can talk to about this stuff?
No, honestly, I don't. Actually, when I graduated, all my Chinese Peruvian friends went to Canada. I don't know why.
Oh,
Everybody
interesting.
went to Canada, and I honestly don't. I am not sure if there is a Chinese Peruvian people reading Cixin Liu's or any Chinese science fiction. I believe there might be, but science fiction is currently being read by younger people. They're always trying to grab the books, and we don't actually we don't have a lot of stock. When a book arrives to Lima, they disappear. We you have to be aware of when a certain book is arriving. Right now, for example, I am waiting for the new translation from Liu that we had. It's a stories. I don't know the name. Let me tell you. It's the new short stories. Sostener el cielo. Something with sky in the title.
Oh yeah, the English name is Hold Up Half the Sky.
Yeah, that one. That's the new one that we had published a few weeks ago. And for example, it is currently on sale in Spain, but we're waiting for it to arrive to Latin America, and it's going to take at least 3 months, maybe 6 months because of the pandemics, and that sucks.
Yeah, I thought of this question earlier and forgot to ask it. Like, if you walk into a big commercial bookshop in Lima and you go looking for Chinese sci-fi, what do you think you'd be likely to find?
You will definitely find the Three Body Problem. That's the one.
Hmm.
And then I saw Vagabonds from Jing Feng Hao the other day.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool, cool.
it's really great, to find her in a bookstore. I really enjoyed Folding Beijing. Actually, that's the reason why I jumped to the Chinese science fiction. And yeah, I really enjoyed Vagabonds, although it was a really long book. But
Yeah, long and
yeah,
slow,
yes,
but it's good.
yes, yeah, it was good. It was good. And yeah, well, Xixin Liu, Jing Feng Hao, Waste Tide, it's also there, but it's
Mm.
not on the first thing that you see when you enter a bookstore. It depends on the bookstore actually, because the main two bookstores that we have here, they tend to sell fiction. As I said before, in Latin America, people tend to choose, fiction, just fiction. People are boring sometimes. And but when there is a specialized bookstore, you have literally a whole wall full of science fiction books, and there you can find the Chinese science fiction books.
Mm. Yeah, my experience here is kind of similar. Like in big kind of commercial normal bookshops in the UK, Three Bodies almost certainly going to be there. If it's big enough, you'll have some other ones. Like Waste Tide was definitely there when it was new. There's a really nice UK edition of Waste Tide out. See if I can send you the cover. It's the version I have. It got delayed a few times, but it's amazing. Let me see if I can get it up. I really embarrassed myself because I met the publishers and I told them I thought I'd seen that edition on a bookshelf. And they're like, wait, it's not out yet. You couldn't have seen it. And they were kind of disturbed. And I realized like the next day, no, I totally misremembered. I saw it online and I freaked them out. Yeah, here it is. I'll send you the link.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it is. So that was on the shelves when it was new. But like it's interesting. Vagabonds I have not seen on any bookshelves here. And some other stuff, like some of the more niche
Mhm.
books, you sometimes see it. Redemption of Time, the fan sequel to Three Body by Bao Shu, I've seen that on shelves, but it's been a lot more Liu Cixin three body centric, I would say. That and I guess Ken Leo's Invisible Planets and Broken Stars, those were fairly common as well. But everything else outside of like Ken Leo Liu Cixin, you'd be more lucky to find it. And as for the
Yeah.
categories, I found in UK bookshops, if it's a big enough bookshop,
Mhm.
sci-fi gets its own section.
Yes.
If it's a smaller one, like the one we have in the town I'm in, Knutsford, there is a Waterstones. That's like the big commercial bookshop company, but it's quite a small one. So there, sci-fi shares its space with fantasy. So like if I found Liu Cixin, I guess here he'd be Cixin Liu. He might be next to a fantasy author whose surname begins with L,
Yes, that happens a lot.
which I think is kind of messed up, but whatever.
Yeah, in here, for example, I buy some books from Waterstones actually. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I really love their limited editions that they have. The last book I bought from them was B.E. Schwab's the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That's fantasy. It's a really gorgeous book. But then again, talking about Chinese science fiction here, we have exactly like you said. Several stores have science fiction and fantasy. We have it's really curious because you can see essentially Three Body Problem next to a Rhythm of War from Brandon Sanderson. It's not even ordered in with names.
Ah,
It's really curious that for example, people don't know about Invisible Planets or Broken Stars. They don't know about Ken Liu, but they know about Ken Liu's novels. It's sort of, I don't know. It's interesting that, but I always, when people tend to ask me about what to read in Chinese science fiction, I told them that to read first Invisible Planets because it's a starter point. And I believe
yeah,
that's
it's a great start.
it's a great start because there you will find not only Folding Beijing but also even Liu's work there. If you like this, you will definitely enjoy the Three Body Problem because Three Body Problem is a great story, but there are three books, and it's going to be a long journey with that. But that's something that I tend to recommend people.
I think a thing that might have benefited Ken Leo in terms of getting his name out was that he's got the same family name as Liu Cixin.
Yeah.
So on bookshelves here, his novels are right next to Three Body Problem. And I can tell you an interesting factoid that I've learned from Chinese fans
Mhm.
of Liu Cixin. So Liu Cixin's nickname in among his fans in China is Dalio, which means Big Leo. I've just sent you that in the chat.
The Dalio.
And they call Ken Leo Xiao Liu. So you can see the second character is the same,
Yeah, the same.
and the
Huh.
first character is the word for small. So Big Leo, Little Leo, Dalio, and Xiao Liu. It sounds almost too sort of obvious to be true, but that's their nicknames with their fans.
And is Ken Liu also renowned in China?
Yeah, I believe his you can get his books in Chinese translation in
Mhm.
China. I really think it helps that he's Chinese American.
Yeah.
I think that makes him more of interest to Chinese readers, which like it's hard for me to put myself in the shoes of those readers because there's no such thing as a British diaspora. There's
Yeah.
just British expats. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
totally different. But it you can't blame Chinese readers or publishers for being interested in publishing Chinese diaspora writers back
Yes.
into Chinese. Seems almost obvious. But I do know there's another Chinese American sci-fi writer whose name, this is terrible. Why can't I think of his name? He is the guy that wrote the story that the movie Arrival is based on.
Ted Chiang?
Yeah, Ted Chiang. That's right. That's embarrassing because I've actually read one of his books. Yeah, I know Ted Chiang is popular with Chinese sci-fi readers in China,
Mhm.
and it's doubly interesting because I don't think Ted Chiang goes out of his way to put anything Chinese into his stories, but I think it just helps that for Chinese readers, he has a Chinese name. I don't think they'd be calling him Ted Chiang. I think they'd be calling him by whatever his Chinese name is.
Yeah.
So it'd be like Jiang something something. But yeah, I've heard from a couple of friends who are into Chinese sci-fi that he's popular with them. I was gonna say, when you mentioned that your Chinese Peruvian friends didn't seem especially interested, that sort of rings true to my limited experience here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a group I regularly take part in called the London Chinese Science Fiction Group,
Okay.
which I think it used to be a real meetup in London, which I couldn't join in with because I was living in Scotland. But in the pandemic, they've switched to like Zoom meetings. And I'm pretty sure that like out of all it's mostly Chinese people who join it, but I think they are mostly people living in China or people who have gone abroad from China to study. So it's like if they are going to be a migrant, they're like first generation. So they're from the mainland China. They got Mandarin names. One of the two leaders, so there's two people who sort of lead the group. One is Liu Guanzhao. He's more or less exactly that. He's from Shanghai. He went to London to do his PhD. He's gone back to China. But the other, so he's like he was a Chinese student abroad. Now he's back in China. The other leader, Angela Chan, she's British Chinese. I'm pretty sure her parents are, or her family, sorry, is a Cantonese, like a Hong Kong background. And I think for most of the British Chinese diaspora, they're in that sort of group. They've been here much longer, and they have a Hong Kong Chinese background.
They made a meeting recently, right? In Zoom, I believe. Where Xiajia was.
Xiajia, yeah, they had Xiajia. I missed that one, and then most recently
I was there.
Chen Qiufan. Oh,
yeah,
right.
Yeah,
oh,
I was there. I didn't know that it was all this. I saw on Twitter and I said I want the link.
Okay, next time we should make sure we're both there. Can say hi.
I believe that Xiajia is the keynote of Xiajia is on YouTube right now. It's really amazing.
Mm-hmm. She's awesome.
But it should be great to know these people that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that it was a very small point I was wanting to make there, but yeah, I noticed that there doesn't seem to be a big, although it's a somewhat UK based group, I don't think there's a very big British Chinese contingent there, or if they are, it's people who've arrived for study very recently, rather than like, I mean, I didn't really grow up next to many Scottish Chinese kids, but from what I gather, someone my age who's British Chinese isn't necessarily going to be any more interested in Chinese pop culture, mainland Chinese pop culture, than your average fellow British person. They might be, but I don't think, based on what I've seen, like it's not an obvious go-to.
Yeah, I think it will depend on the family actually, because how traditional your family is, because on the other hand, in one hand, you can have this traditional family from China that they invite you to this New Year Chinese, dinner or whatever, as I did when I was young with my friends. But then you have this other family that they honestly don't know anything about, or they don't even care about that part of the family,
Yeah,
it will depend, I believe.
I know that for most of the British Chinese diaspora who've been here longer, they're all from Hong Kong because of the imperial connection.
Yes.
So they might themselves not really identify very much with stuff from the mainland. Whereas I don't know if there are Peruvian Chinese people more likely to be from the mainland.
I knew one. I didn't study with this person, but I knew him because he owned this Chinese food restaurant, and I tend to went there before the pandemic, like 2 days per week, and I used to sit there and write because I love the environment they had with this Chinese the gush music sounding as a soundtrack, and it was really amazing. And I met this person, the owner. He was from Hong Kong,
right?
And he was living in Lima for about 15 years, 20 years maybe, and he had these restaurants in the city, in the district. It was a big restaurant. People tend to go there always, and I always knew them. And I believe that. Well, then I had this friend when I studied with them. The family were from some province in China. Honestly, I can't remember the name, but I remember it was some from a province.
Yeah.
The family were just they cultivated. I don't know, but they I remember him telling me something like that, not talking me about their great grandmother and that family, and yeah, that was more traditional.
Yeah, I know a lot of the diaspora from the mainland are from Fujian province or Guangdong province, but
Mhm.
that's like two out of something like 20. So it
Yeah,
could be from anywhere, I guess. Right. I wanted to keep us moving. So I'm gonna do as
sure.
I said. We've got a miscellaneous section where normally I'd ask guests to give us a Chinese word of the day, but we're doing something special because neither of us are fluent in Chinese. And I'm yeah, so we've both got a word, and I've gone for should I, which means era. And that's because whenever I think of Liu Cixin, or whenever I think of something I can stick the word era on the end of, I think of Liu Cixin. That comes from basically from this story and from Three Body, where humanity is going through crazy eras. Like in Three Body, what is it? The bunker era. Here we've got like the rocket booster era, the blah
Yeah,
blah era, and it just makes me think of Liu Cixin. It's totally that big scale, all of humanity is involved, and everything is about this one big event. So I don't know, to give you an example off the top of my head, me and my girlfriend got a hedgehog recently. So right now our household has entered the great hedgehog era. So yeah, should I? That's where I've got that one. And you've got one of your own. I've already forgotten how this is pronounced. I have the characters in front of me. I'm going to have to check it again.
my word.
Yeah.
It's ephemeral. The Chinese translation should be Duan San De, I
Oh
believe.
yeah. Duanzan. Yeah, Duanzan.
Yeah, Duan San De. Yeah, I really love that word because, ephemeral means transitory, something fleeting, short-lived, momentary. And as I told you before, that's something that I always have in mind when reading Liu Cixin's works, because it makes us, it at least as a reader, it makes me believe that, or realize at least, that this life is really short. And the earth is just a rock in the middle of the space going nowhere. And that's it. It's something that happens to your brain when you're reading Cixin Liu. It's really, really interesting because it makes you, I don't know, it makes you live your present a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, I always tend to have grab something like that when I'm reading Liu's works.
Yeah, on this show, I'm always trying to bring up anything existential that I can, and I think it's true. The what is it? The basic premise of existentialism, all sort of the values we've received are based on nothing. Nothing
Yeah,
essential has its own essential meaning. Which, if that's your starting point, that's really depressing. But the next logical step is
yeah.
okay, make your own meaning, take control of your life, which is difficult, but it's happy and uplifting. So it makes a lot of sense that that's the feeling you get. I guess we should also say, as the Spanish word for ephemeral. If you taught this one to me, right? Efimero,
Efímero.
efimero, right? Efimero, like
Yeah.
ephemeral, ephemeral. Excellent. Now the next one, it's pieces of music that we'd pair with this story. I've got one. Do you have one in mind?
Yeah, I have two actually. Well, obviously the
Excellent.
first one is the it's a classical piece from the, I don't know how to say it. It's the Gymnopédie number one. Uh, Eric Satie's Gymnopédie number one. It's called to be one of the saddest pieces of music. Obviously, if you everybody heard that piece of music, the Gymnopédie number one from Eric Satie. And the second one is from a Chinese singer. The way I discovered him was because of maybe you're aware of this YouTuber that tends to show the Chinese agricultural stuff, like Li Shiki, I believe. I don't know how to say her name.
I've not come across her.
I will send you the link. It's really amazing. Anyway, the singer name is Mao Boyi, and then the song is Drowning Sorrows.
Mao Buyi, Xiao Chou, Drown One's Sorrows.
Yeah,
right?
that's it's a sad one, but there is a chorus when they say that they raise a glass to the future, to the moon, to all that stuff, and it really resonates with me with this story, because again, we talk about the scientists and the future and how the humanity has to survive, but if we have to summarize all this, it's about the Earth leaving the place where it stayed for 1,000 years. 角落固执地唱着苦涩的歌，听它在喧嚣里被淹没。你拿起酒杯对自己说：一杯敬朝阳，一杯敬月光，唤醒我的向往，温柔了寒窗，于是可以不回头的逆风飞翔。That's something that, for example, from the movie, the scene that I really loved more, when everybody tend to say goodbye Earth or goodbye Sun, and in different languages at the beginning from the movie. That's something that I really loved.
Yeah, the internationalism in the film is an interesting one, where the countries never mix, but they all sort of get their flags and their little moments and their languages. The bit that I kept waiting watching that film for like some kind of interesting international collaboration, and you just get the bit when everyone is in their little shuttle cockpits and they've got their like flags, and it goes through like stereotypes. So like the Americans are all tired and exhausted, the French have surrendered, the Japanese have impaled themselves on their swords, and then the Chinese come to save the day. It's the United Nations version of internationalism. But yeah, thanks for those recommendations. I've got one. I was a little bit stuck, but while I was working, I was listening to like all my music on shuffle, and this song I hadn't listened to in years came on, and it's like a very silly, cartoony song. So I would say it's not really as high-minded as your choices, but I think it kind of captured some stuff from the story. So it's like a prog rock, British modern prog rock band's track. So it's like 10 minutes long. It's called Black Light Machine by a band called Frost. And it starts off with this sense of wonder, kind of magical feeling. And it's the guy talking about how he's just a boy, but he's going to become a real man. And then at the end, the song gets more crazy. And I thought, oh, that's a lot like this story. So I'm going to edit. When I'm editing this, I'll put all of our song choices in, but I'm going to crank the volume in my headphones to max and play it through the microphone. Hopefully that you'll hear.
Great.
You'll hear it. Here we go. So here's the starting bit. Okay, so that's the cheerful opening. And then if I can find the bit where it goes crazy, let me see. I think it's about here. Turn the volume back down. So yeah, not very dark, but I thought it captured some of the energy of the story.
You said that it's 10 minutes long.
Yeah, it's 10 minutes long track.
What's the name? I want to listen to it full.
Sure, it's called Black Light Machine, and it's by a band called Frost.
Frost. Okay.
And they're a British band. They're from, in fact, they're English. They're very English. The album cover, I'll just send you the link. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's like, you know how, I don't know, Pink Floyd, they're very English. This is a very English band too, I think.
Oh,
It's got the
okay.
red telephone
Yeah.
box.
Yeah, that's really English.
Yeah. Right. So that was our second miscellaneous question. Our last one now, this is one I'm going to edit out of the main episode. I'm going to make it its own thing for my Patreon, just so I can give. I've only got like 10 subscribers, but I try to keep giving them stuff.
It's okay. It's great.
Yeah. So this is a really stupid question. All of the Chinese sci-fi writers get into a big fight. Who do you think is going to win? I guess we've analyzed that one as much as we can. Might have been more interesting to think about all the Chinese authors, because like Mo Yan, he's kind of heavy. If he ran fast enough, he could power through all these sci-fi writers easily. Right, on to our last questions, further reading questions. So if listeners are thinking, I'd like to read more stuff like The Wandering Earth, where would you want to send them to?
Well, if they haven't read yet Invisible Planets and Broken Stars, that's where I would direct them. I didn't read Broken Stars yet. I didn't have the chance, but because that's a book that I want to enjoy. You know, I want time to read them because Invisible Planets, at least for me, was a mind-blowing experience. It was the first book I read, and it was a book that started me in this, Chinese science fiction genre, and it was really, really amazing. After that, I really enjoyed Waste Tide. It's a book that it's an interesting book. It's chaotic, it's wild, and it's also a good, a proposal that Chen Qiufan has, and I really enjoyed it. Those are two books that I recommend.
Yeah, you mentioned Invisible Planets and Broken Stars, and I would for my recommendations, I would basically just second that. And it's a really great case of like, you watch the first in a series, or you read a first in a series. No, I'll use the example of movies. You watch the first movie and you think, wow, that was great. And then there's a sequel. Knowing there's a sequel could mean, great, I get the same thing again. It's not over. Fantastic. There's more to enjoy. Or it could be like, oh no, there's a sequel. What if the sequel ruins it? What if it's terrible? And my experience reading Broken Stars is basically you get the same thing again and it's just as good.
Okay.
But there's a bonus. There's more authors. So it's not just the same authors again. You get most, if not all of the same authors, but a lot of them only have one story. So like in Invisible Planets, most of the authors have 2 or 3 stories under their name. Broken Stars goes for a bit more of a spread. So more authors, less stories for each author. And it goes in different directions. So there's a story which is like a fusion of historical China, but also with sci-fi. And there's like some comedy as well. So it goes in other directions.
Yeah.
Ken Leo's choices go to places that he didn't go for with Invisible Planets. So totally if readers want more, I think they should start with Invisible Planets, then go to Broken Stars. That would be my recommendation. The next further reading question, Jairo, what are you reading just now?
Right now I am reading let me grab the book. This one.
Oh yeah,
it's The Romancer. Yeah, I told you before, this is a new translation from William Gibson's Neuromancer, and I am rereading it again, and yeah, the translation is different. It feels better, in my opinion. But yeah, it's basically the book that started all, right? The cyberpunk genre and everything.
Yeah, I have not read that one. So like, I had this, probably quite particular to someone like me. I first learning about Chen Qiufan and preparing to interview him and learning about him for my dissertation, I saw all this stuff saying he's China's William Gibson, and I was like, who's that? Who's William Gibson? Which is probably the reverse from most sci-fi readers. But actually, it's the ways I've learned about William Gibson has mostly been in relation to like Chen
Mhm.
or discussions. Cyberpunk is it's an interesting one because it's often makes use of like these um
The dark themes, and all that, and all the thing is more like noir sometimes.
yeah, dark themes and noir, but using like futuristic sort of Asian or
Yes.
Asian aesthetic cities as their settings. I
Mhm.
recently read a blog post by a guy that went into that visions of like an East Asian future in Neuromancer, and I learned like some of Neuromancer does take place in like Tokyo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes me very curious because the
Can you
blogger.
send me that link later,
Sure,
please?
yeah, I'll put it in my show notes. It's a guy who's on Twitter. He's extremely online. I think he's basically just what I used to be. He's like a foreigner teaching English in China, but he's used it to
Great.
I don't know, he's he's gone a bit further than your average Lawai, your average foreigner, basically. He goes by the online name Yoshimi, but like he's a white guy.
Okay.
He's not Japanese.
But you
The
know, yeah, you talking about this, how you didn't read this book yet. It reminded me that, you know, the first cyberpunk book I read was, you know, waist tight, actually, because I mean, the only science fiction books that I read before were, you know, the three dystopian novels from the 20th century are, you know, George Orwell, 1984, Aldous Huxley with Mundo Feliz, Happy World, I believe. And then it's Ray Bradbury with Fahrenheit 4.1. And those are books. Then Ursula K. Le Guin.
oh yeah,
But then I didn't read William Gibson or K. Dick. Some stories, then Asimov, some stories, and Foundation. But the truth is that I started enjoying more this kind of science fiction when I started reading the Chinese ones, because I realized this is good. This is really, really good. And as you said, they saying that Chen Qifan is like China's William Gibson is a way of telling us this is the, you know, the future of all these past authors that we had. We are evolving. The Chinese fiction is always, with science fiction is always evolving.
mm,
And yeah, that's something that I really like.
yep. Here's that link I mentioned. So
Great.
I don't think it's a perfect blog. It just kind of reads like a guy firing thoughts off the top of his head at points. But
Mhm.
it's this perspective of a reader reading Neuromancer,
Yeah.
looking for like all sort of examining all of this American author's fixations on these
Mhm.
Asian places, like Hong Kong. I think specifically Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Singapore,
Yeah.
and the sort of fantasies about this places someone like William Gibson has. But I liked it because he's not just trying to scold William Gibson, saying like, "Look, you stupid American, you have all these silly projections of what you want to see on to these cities." He's saying,
Mhm.
on one hand, that is true, but on the other hand, he was doing something interesting as a writer, and there's a good reason that people still look to him as a guy who had an interesting vision. But I think it's also true what you said. The world evolves, sci-fi evolves, and now the idea that the future might Hong Kong is the future seems a bit more questionable now. It might be that Shenzhen or Beijing or Shanghai is a future, or those still might be silly projections of
Yeah.
Westerners who are more interested in the exciting pictures in their head than any kind of reality.
Yes, actually, I believe more that in Shenzhen, it's more for me the future right now, because of, you know, it's like our Chinese Silicon Valley. But the way the cyberpunk as a genre and a, you know, the key visual it has, it was because of Ridley Scott with Blade Runner.
Mm,
And then we always copy that until now, until you know, Danny Villeneuve came and he reimagined that genre with the Blade Runner 2049. And in that time, for example, you had a cyberpunk with all things gathered. Everything was saturated. The rain, the color, the neon colors. But now the cyberpunk is going, it's being more minimalistic,
mm.
white spaces, all that stuff, and probably it's going to be more like a solar punk, you know, more like an example. A great example of solar punk is Wakanda. What we see in the Marvel movies, it's a great example, but people don't realize that. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's something that I saw watching that genre evolve.
Yeah, I've heard the word solarpunk a lot, and like on one hand, I wouldn't want sci-fi to stay sort of frozen in the 80s. On the other hand, like you mentioned Wakanda there, it's basically a picture of a happy, developed, wonderful place.
Yeah,
and to me, it's like, I don't want to read about happy places. I want to read about awful things happening to people.
I think the same. I want that same thing. You know, I will always love cyberpunk and the dystopian thing, and where everything goes bad.
Yeah. I guess that's not a happy note, but that's a decent note to end our discussion on. Is there anything else we missed you'd like to get in there before we say goodbye?
No, actually, I believe it was all that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, totally. Extremely comprehensive. So yeah, thanks Jairo for coming on.
Thanks to you. Thanks for inviting me. And I hope to be back again and talk about more science fiction. I will try to read Broken Stars.
Well, the good news there is that's something like at least 12 stories. So that's at least 12 episodes.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll look forward to that.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right, that is the end of the interview and almost the end of the episode. You may be interested to know that as I read you this outro, I've got a little hedgehog, an African pygmy hedgehog by the name of Millie, sitting on my lap, wrapped in a little pink blanket. That's the new pet that's entered my life. If you want to see little glimpses of Millie every now and then and keep up with the show, then you can follow the podcast on Instagram. I'm sure I'll find excuses to include my little Tsuwei Xiao Pengyo on the feed, the Instagram stories. So the podcast's handle is @Trchific, TRCHFIC. If you'd like some hedgehog free updates, although no promises, you can follow just my own Twitter. That's what I use for the show and some other stuff, but basically just the show. It's @AngusLikesWords. If you've not checked out the podcast homepage yet, which I guess is entirely possible, it's Trchific.podbean.com. You really should go there. All sorts of fun stuff. Speaking of all sorts of fun stuff, god damn it, go sign up to the Patreon because there's a bonus episode there. Well, I've been doing it every week. I might need to slow output down, but regardless, there's like 60 plus bonus shows up there, averaging about half an hour long, and I'm always putting new stuff up, whether it's talking about books I've read or a short story or a film I've watched, or those extensive thoughts I'm going to share on the Taiwan Lit Symposium in Leeds that I attended. It'll all be there, and it'll all be fantastic, of course. It's a lot more freestyle than the show. I tend not to edit, so there's it's much more off the cuff, Angus, usually almost always just solo. So if you want to hear more of that, it's up there. It's cheap. It's $1 a month. I think you can afford that, he said smugly. That's the end of the show. So before I go, most important thing you can do is, of course, to tell your friends, your family, your teacher, and the Japanese wife who inevitably betrays you, even if it was for good reasons, for the benefit of mankind. Tell her as well, of course. And until the next episode, I will say to you, 再见.